Welcome. Good morning, everyone. Super nice to see you all here. Welcome to this new series of discussion around children's literature, the representation series. We're really pleased that you're able to join in today. My name's Rabani, and I'll be moderating the session. I'm currently doing doctoral work and research at the University of Pennsylvania in the field of children's literature, young adult media, and I worked at different times as a librarian, as a storyteller, editor, and a publisher of a children's magazine in Delhi. We have an exciting panel of speakers, and I have a pleasure of introducing you to today. Thank you, Squibby, India, Shiny, and Tanu for getting us all together. Before we start with the introductions to the panel, I wanted to share just a few logistical things. This session is being recorded, so I hope that's okay with you. And it'll be available, I think, on Squibby India's blog, or maybe Tanu will send the link out. We will do brief introductions for everyone. This will be followed by questions for the panel. Please feel free to ask questions, share insights and comments in the chat, and we'll try to get to these as we move along the session. And we hope to create an interactive space today. We will have about 20 minutes at the end for an open discussion. And also, please do keep your microphones off if you're not speaking. And starting with the introduction to our panel, we'll start with Samina. Samina Mishra is a documentary filmmaker, writer, and a teacher based in New Delhi, India, with an interest in media for and about children. Her work uses the lens of childhood, identity, and education to reflect the experiences of growing up in India. She also runs the Magic Key Center for Arts and Education. Thank you for being um, Vinuta Malya. Thank you for joining in today. She's a senior editor at People's Archive of Rural India, the digital journalism platform for stories of rural Indians. She has worked in journalism and book publishing for 2 decades, and we're really looking forward to hearing from you today. Anushka, oh, there you are, I couldn't find you. Anushka Ravishankar is the author of over 30 books for children, several of which have won awards and have been published internationally. She's the co-founder of Duckbill Books, formerly an indie publishing house for children. And finally, Charles Mahajan is a writer, activist, layabout, part feline, somewhat human, genderqueer, queer feminist fellow who lives in Bombay, but mainly in their head. They have been a part of Labia, queer feminist LBT collective for over 2 decades. And we thank you all for being here today. We are missing Ruby. She unfortunately could not join in. So we're ready to start. Thank you all for making time. We'll be talking about representation in children's literature, the presence and absence of certain experiences, identities, and groups, which groups come to be rendered invisible or visible in children's literature, and to what effect, and how do we create work that is inclusive and spaces that are inclusive. What are some of the larger issues that we see in the field? Get to some of these questions today in this first discussion at Squibby. So we'll start with defining diversity. And this is for all of you on the panel, and in no particular order. So if one of you would like to get us started, when we talk about diversity, what are we really talking about? And how do you see this reflected in the work that you do, whether as a writer or an educator or a publisher or an activist? Who do we include when we think of diverse voices, diverse experiences, diverse stories? And who are we making this diverse for? And I think one of the things, sorry, I had this sort of like multiple questions around this. And I think one of the things I'd really like you also to maybe think about and reflect on as we go along is that who else or who all need to be on the Indian Kidlit table, and why is it important? And it's open for any of you, whoever wants to take a first sort of stab at it or get us started.
Samina,
Pehle aap. Okay, I'll have a go at it. I'll have a go. So I think, I mean, we have to have as many people as possible at the table. It is about being able to recognize that diversity, I think, is a kind of dynamic and fluid thing. We can't just have a fixed understanding of it. No, like 30 years ago, we did not imagine that we have to have a place at the table for, like, say, trans people. But we know that we have to. So I think this that's the first thing, that we have to understand that it's not a fixed idea. No, this concept of diversity is an abstract idea, but the way it plays itself out has to remain dynamic, you know. And I think that it is about just having as many people at the table as possible. But to me, it's actually not so much about that, but it is about the way that we understand how to represent it. So to me, it is not so much about content, but also like formal choices. And we can talk more in detail about that later, that it's not only about, you know, ticking boxes and saying, okay, we have so and so at the table, but actually, like, what are we doing with that? Yeah. So I mean, we can talk more after everything.
I don't know if this is the point at which I should bring in this thought, but I was just thinking that if we're talking about representation, we also need to remember that we are already outsiders in the space of writing for children, because we are not children, you know. We are already writing uh, for an audience that's not us in that sense. So, I mean, so like you said, the idea of diversity is quite a complex thing. It's not just a question of, and also, I also see, you know, I also think about how much, what are the kinds of people that we think about as other, no? That also is something that we need to maybe bring into the conversation, because we may be ignoring a lot of people that we actually don't even think about, because they're so other to us.
Yeah, and I think that's, I guess, again, I think one of the things which sort of both of you are sort of referencing to is this idea of, like, when we talk about diversity or creating diverse literature, for example, like, who are we actually creating it for, right? Are we creating it for people who are missing, or are we already creating it for the dominant audience that we have, let's say, right? So are we making it visible to this sort of audience we're already writing to, if that makes sense? Look,
Yeah.
Vishal, you
Hi.
were saying, yeah.
Hi, Rabari. Thank you. And thank you, Swibi. And it's such a good thing to be here with all of you for something that, you know, is quite close to my heart in some sense, but also to my ideas. And so, you know, I kind of was thinking of what Samina is saying, diversity is dynamic. And I want to say that we are, and what Anushka said, we are talking about an adult organization of the world in a very hierarchical manner. That's the world we are dealing with. And when we are talking as adults, we are creating material for children. There's a lot of that adult organization of the world that's part of it. You know, so whether it is the publishing scene, whether it is the ideology of who gets to write and all of that, you know, it's part of this whole hierarchical organization. And so it's not just about the writing and the illustrations, it's also about the whole industry as such. So one has to keep on sort of talking at both these levels, because the industry is not really accessible in many ways to many people. It is controlled by a lot of interests and a lot of legacies of different kinds of hierarchies of, you know, class, caste, language, you know, and all of that. Morality. But what I would also like to say, that when we are talking about what I want to add to this discussion for now, and maybe we can discuss it more, is to say that somewhere when we are talking about what is diversity and what is the difference that we want to talk about, one is about talking about inclusivity or exclusivity, looking at what are the voices that we are bringing in, or who's writing, who's the audience, for whom are books being written, And when we say inclusivity, exclusivity, it is often about what is the worldview you're bringing onto the table. What is the location from which you're writing to the table? So there is this thing of who all are there. So of course that more and more people need to join in at different ways so that more voices are heard. But the second important thing also, which I think is equally crucial for everybody and all writers and everybody else, is that when we write, in our writing, what is the worldview we're bringing there? You know, so it's about not just having more people on the table, it's also about for each one of us who's part of this sort of complex thing to say, what are we bringing to the thing? What is our writing about? What is it reflective of? What is the worldview that we are bringing in into our books? And I think that's a very critical element.
I have one question for you, Charles, and I think, and I guess for everyone else, and then I have a specific question.
Sorry, Rabani, can I just pitch in here a bit?
Yes.
In response to the first question. I think we should be honest that when we, in these forums, when we talk about diversity and, whom we are writing books for, it's very clearly that we are talking about books that we are producing for a certain segment of our population that is more literate, that has more means. There are, purchasing power to buy books, etc., and the geographical sort of urban scenario from which we are operating. I think publishing as a whole, and this is echoing what Charles just said and what even Samina and Anushka have sort of touched upon, is that publishing as a whole has to be able to enable many more people being able to tell their own stories, rather than us trying to tell other stories or trying to find how we can make things diverse. I think the thing that we have to be aware of is that many people are not able to tell their own stories, and they should be able to tell their own stories rather than others telling stories for them. And that there should be infrastructure that can support that entire creation, production, and distribution of this kind of storytelling. So that's just the broad sort of thing that I wanted to introduce. But yeah, we'll probably talk aspects of this as we go along, I'm sure.
Thank you for bringing that in, Vinuta. That's really, it gets to that question of like who else needs to be on this table, which is not sort of just making space for somebody to sit, but actually, like you said, creating the infrastructure for them to write their own stories, to be able to have access, for children to have access to these different identities that can come here. Related to this, I was also thinking about in the work that you do and the spaces that you occupy, how do you see some of this reflected in how you take this up? Is there like sort of, are you, yeah, in your career and the work that you've created till now?
Is that question for Charles? Did you say that question was for Charles, Rabani?
It's for everyone, but if Charles wants to take it, just sort of talk about that.
Sure. Okay, let me specifically then talk a little bit about my work to see that, to bring the critical lens, as it were, to what I'm doing. Clearly, I am middle class, I am Savarna, I'm Hindu, and I'm a very urban person. And these are locations, and this is my experience. It has been from small cities and towns to larger metros, but it is a very sort of urban location. It is a location of a person who's educated in English, who has that. It is also somebody who's been in queer and feminist politics for a long time. So there are some things that, I bring to the table. At the same time, I think the location is also something that clearly makes it possible for me to write certain things and not write certain things, right? So if I take the example of my books, Timmy Entangles and Timmy and Rizu, they're very urban location books. I mean, they could be in a smaller town or a largish town or but they're not books that talk about or are located in other parts of the country, right? So there is that, because I somewhere feel that thing as being an urban writer means that that is my familiar place, which I can write most easily from. But that does not mean that I cannot be critical or look carefully at what constitutes that world. So that's, one thing. I'm not saying that I'm actually doing a very great job of it, but I'm saying that, I'm very aware of this is the kind of location that I have, and which I bring to my books also to a large extent. But at the same time, I think what I try is to bring some of the wonkiness of my head and how I see the relationships between children and adults, and to bring that into the writing as well. Or rather, it sort of happens to be in the writing, but one can see it from the outside. And also that, how do adults and children interact? What constitutes togetherness? What constitutes communication or negotiation? And that's, I think, an important aspect for me, that when we are especially talking as adults, then how are we talking to children, with children? That where is that, what is that relationship of negotiation? Because so much of, when I look back at school and from my other work, and as a queer trans feminist person, and I see that there is so much where families and schools are these places where children are indoctrinated. And so somewhere there is this constant push to make children into, good citizens, good girls, good boys, good students, good, daughters and sons. And so somewhere that is something that is very oppressive. And that, in the particular location I come from, is oppressive in a particular way. So I try to write from the location I know a little bit, but also bring in these ideas. Clearly, I think when I see, say, a book like Rinchan's I Will Save My Land, where the child is connected to the family in a very different way. The child is actually part of the struggles that the family is also part of, collective struggles against big corporations in trying to save tribal land from Adivasi land from, a corporation takeover. The connection of that child to their community, to the ideas, is very different than, say, urban middle class household where these negotiations are happening. So I think one is fairly aware of that sort of thing as well. So I'll just leave this for now, but one can go ahead and talk more.
And we will, Samina, Anushka, do you want to add something to that? And then I have a question for Vinuta around sort of the history of publishing.
Yeah. I wanted to say, so I feel one of the things that we really need to kind of break away from is the kind of, binary understanding. So we are always thinking of like, this is the problem and this is the way to fix it. That's not necessarily true. And it's the same thing with the idea of kind of representation, that so often we are defining, this in opposition to what is on the table. But those are not the only two polarities, right? There's a whole thing in the middle that we need to create room for. So I think one of the problems is that if we only think in binaries, then we are not exploring that. So we need many voices, but it is not, it's not a given that because someone comes from, say, like, I'm sort of, I've been brought up as a Muslim and I write about a Muslim character, it's not a given that I will not reproduce stereotype. That's the challenge of craft, that we have to be constantly interrogating ourselves when we are actually in practice. So to just imagine that because, someone with a Muslim name is at the table, it means we have covered the bases. That's not true, So we need to be able to, I think for me, and this is connected to what Charles is talking about, worldview, this idea is actually that for us as writers, and this is, I think, true for publishers as well, and it's another kind of practice, but for us as writers, it is about how do we observe, how do we engage with life around us, and how do we reflect on it, It has to come from that. So, of course, our location, where we come from, they give us a kind of entry point into certain spaces. But in some ways, we are always the other, no? We are always writing something, another kind of character. We are not we are not writing ourselves every time. So I think this idea of constantly interrogating ourselves has to be the basis of being able to open the discussion out beyond the kind of binaries, whether it is about who comes to the table or whether it is about how we understand what these, conceptual ideas mean.
So just very, very briefly, I just want to say this, that speaking about my own work, as you all know, my work is mostly, my writing is mostly just fun stuff, right? Nonsense and things like that. So for me, the important thing when I started writing was, of course, to just write books that were enjoyable for children to read. And they're not overtly political in intent in that sense. Like I'd never set out to write a book saying that I will show, one particular thing. I just write books that are, I just think of a story that's fun for kids, but still, as Charles pointed out, one's worldview is really important when you're writing for kids. So, so it's not like I'm unaware, I'm constantly aware of who I'm writing about and who are the people there. Like all of us, I come from the same kind of, the background that I come from does, I am aware that I am privileged and, urban, English speaking, all of that. So with those things already, with those restrictions, if you can call them that, one has to try and still include, different kinds of children in the work. So I'm already saying that I'm writing only for fun. I'm not being political. And yet, how does one still include? So one thing I find important is that just, it may be a very nominal kind of representation, but still, I think it's just important to reflect the diversity that we see, say, in a classroom, in the stories that we write, which doesn't always happen. Like which is why I made Moin. He's like any other kid. I didn't, his Muslimness is not evident anywhere except he's just like any other kid, but it's still, I find it so nice when I go to a classroom where there's a good mix of kids, when children get excited because they really have not seen kids with their own names in books. It's strange because I don't see why that happens. And if it happens in a very, knobs on kind of way. So I wanted it to be something that, he just happens to be another kid. And so that I think has its own place, I don't think that's always the way to do it, but it has its own place. So, so that's what I'm saying. When you're writing, you just have to be constantly aware. I think Samina and Charles have already said it, so I won't repeat that. But I just wanted to say that sometimes just having the names there makes a difference.
Also because increasing in the real world context now, we may not find that, diversity in a classroom. So
absolutely, I have noticed that because in Delhi, when I go to a school, I specifically ask sometimes, and there are very few schools in which you'll find even one Muslim kid in the class, and it's so strange to me because we didn't grow up like that. We grew up with all kinds of different children in our classes.
Yeah, Muslim maybe still, but I feel like in terms of class and caste, that diversity just doesn't. Yeah, like
and
now.
And that sort of also reflects, right? Like in the literature that's also coming out, right? So there is, that sort of, I think, Vinudha, I'd really, we exchanged an email about this, and I thought that would be sort of, where you mentioned the sort of historical view of Indian publishing and sort of this diversity that was reflected to the state institutions, and would love for you to share some of that.
Yeah, very quickly. I mean, the fact is that there are certain kinds of diversities that were represented in books. If you look at what the National Book Trust and all published in the early times, in their early days, and what Children's Book Trust used to do and still continues in some ways. There was a representation, there was a geographical diversity of some sort, there was some sort of religious diversity, there was diversity of subject matter, for instance, in all these books. If you look at the catalogs of, I mean, many of them are out of print today, but that organic diversity that already existed in our society was somehow reflected. But after 90s, when, post-liberalization, when the society has itself become so sort of, there's so much more disparity now. And that disparity is also resulting in certain kinds of things not showing up in books that are being published anymore. At least books that are visible to us. I mean, there are there are things like what Ekalavya does in Bhopal, for instance, their books, what Pratham is trying to do, and what, of course, what Tulika and all have been doing for a while. So these, and I'm not just talking multilingual, I'm also talking about a certain kind of very conscious differences that are being brought into the content. Um, so in that sense, I mean, taking off, that's really the brief thing that I wanted to talk about history of children's book publishing that I'm aware of. I'm sure many people know more than this, but there was, in my mind, an organic diversity that we grew up with when we were kids and we had these books. And a template that was set to us by the Soviet books that many of, a slightly older generation of people grew up with. There was a template set for books that, and you had many more subjects like popular science, you had environment and all coming through very easily into children's book publishing. Now we have to talk about it, we have to kind of talk about these issues and say we need more books about this. So something has happened in this time. And I think as authors and as publishers, if we don't engage with the process of our times, like we did, I mean, it was heartening to see how writers like Samina in Delhi, Swayoni, Arundhati in Bangalore, and all, took active part, Richa, took active part in the anti-CA, anti-NRC protests. And that is really, you've got to be engaged. I mean, we've all got to be engaged with what is happening around us to be able to even understand what is it that we need to be writing about, right? I mean, a lot of writers do this, but I mean to say this as a publishing industry as a whole, and this is not just for children's books, this is for all books. So I feel that it's kind of, when we look at diversity as a foreign concept, and sometimes this is how it's coming into us, racism and colorism and gender, and these are there, of course, and we have to address them. But there are really many, many concepts that are in our own, within our own system that we need to take up very consciously. For some people, diversity is religious diversity. So, there's this whole thing that, okay, if we represent a Muslim in a book, it is diverse. But we are really talking about many kinds of diversities, and it's lingual, it's caste, class, it's geographical, it's haves, have-nots. So all of that has to come onto the table.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Vinuta. That sort of leads very naturally to this question that I had around trends in Indian kid literature. But I do want to address some of the questions that are up in the chat. Asha and Rupa brought this concept of own voices, and we will get to that, this idea of like who gets to write whose book, and this whole debate of own voices, which is its own thing, which we should definitely get to in a few minutes. And then something that was also, again, Asha shared, which is sort of this idea of tick in the box books, which are marketed as books about X or Y instead of as great stories. Yeah. I don't know if anyone wants to sort of look at that. This idea of like, I think what she's trying to get at is that these books get overlooked. I'm going to read out her question. The organic diversity that authors like Anushka use in a very natural and unself-conscious way sadly get overlooked if they're not highlighted as marketing points by the publisher. This has led to a rise in some very tick in the box books, which are marketed as books about X or Y instead of as great stories. So I guess, again, thinking of like, what do we mean by diversity? And like Vinita said, just having these sort of labels of like particular labels that I don't know if I should use the word Western, but in some ways are also coming from there.
Yes, of course they are. I mean, when Black Lives Matter becomes big, then suddenly here also we are, talking about diversity in a way. So we do get that.
Yeah. So I guess sorry, did I cut someone off?
Yeah, hi. No, I'm going to say this. Actually, I don't know. Maybe I don't engage with the publishing industry as much as I ought, or, in some ways, probably I'm not, but I don't see diversity. I mean, maybe, and also I don't go to schools very much. So probably I'm coming from a place where I really sit mainly in my head, and actually, as somebody who engages with a lot of political movements and people's movements around. So to me, diversity is something which is very much what one is learning from being in the here and now in India today, and have been learning in our country for the last so many years, where there have been so many people's struggles, and they have been about a lot of marginal voices fighting for their rights, fighting for change of structures within here. So to me, when we say inclusivity or diversity, to me, it's not something coming from anywhere else, but coming from the voices of all the people who've been raising different issues, whether it's of livelihood, whether it's of recognition, whether it's of rights. If you look at the whole feminist movements, to talk about gender in a way that makes sense in very orthodox society. If you look at the very powerful caste movements, anti-caste movements, then how this very Brahmanical, hierarchical, patriarchal society sort of really dealing has continuously left people out. So to me, diversity is a very sort of thing which is completely, in some sense, missing from the fabric of the world that we live in. Because we are such a hierarchical society where there's such a lot of focus on who belongs in what place and people should stay. I mean, if you look at the whole the right wing, a lot of the Hindu right wing is about, putting people in place. And that's around religion, that's around caste, that's around gender. And so this is, it's about region, it's about language. So I think this is, today you have the farmers struggle. I mean, farmers are suddenly being called anti-national. So I think when we're talking diversity, we're not talking anywhere else, we're talking here. And I wanted to actually respond to Vinita, because I am not sure that I agree with you that there was a lot of different kind of writing with those NBT books and so on and so forth. But I also feel that there was has been a way of looking at children's literature in a very didactic fashion, or sort of teaching values of certain kind fashion. And I'm not sure that diversity means that. Because I think that continuously, when you're trying to have this whole didactic sort of thing of, teaching certain values, it is the most normative, it is the most sort of, what is considered universal. This assumption of universality in literature is a very dangerous notion, because then it's only like the most powerful, the most sort of ideas of the most powerful people that get conveyed, right? So what it means to be a good citizen is to not question the state. What it means to be a good child is to not question your family, to respect your elders, which is not what children's writing should be doing. And I think there is that shift from that as well, because I think it's important. I think it's important for to not take that for granted, but at the same time, I definitely see that perhaps when we're talking about the production of literature in English, especially, and we're talking about the kind of schools and buying power parents we're talking about very upper class, very mainstream, very normative sort of buying power. I don't know. So maybe for those people, diversity is coming from. But when you look at the amount of writing being done here, and in that sense, I think what we have is so much rich literature in so many languages that actually we need a lot of inter-language translations, so that we have all different kinds of literature available to many of us. I mean, as somebody who speaks and reads only 2 languages, I completely feel hampered to not be able to access so much wonderful literature and children's writing for children in this country itself. So I feel that when we're talking about diversity, to me, we are talking about in the here and now, but maybe I'm also talking for a space which is not very much in tune with the publishing industry. So, I could take that.
Actually, Charles, if you look at the early National Book Trust books, they're not didactic. They're in fact they're quite nice to read, and even today they're quite nice to read. But yes, I mean, they didn't move with the times either. So I'm not making a case to say that they're the model. They didn't really, explore many kinds of diversity. So there was a certain kind of diversity that shows through in those books. There are many that are excluded too because of who is producing these books and who are making the decisions, etc. So I take your point on that, and that's true. But what has happened is when state institutions, because of the very nature of state funding, uh, there's a certain amount of more diversity that comes through just by the nature of how the money is distributed and where it goes, right? Which in private publishing does not happen if you look at the structure. So from those points of view, there are differences if one studies how books that were produced by the state at a particular time in our history and books that were produced by, so the private publishers were more prone to producing these moral science books where, Acha Bacha Kya Karta Hai, those calendars and all of that. So those are, there are some of those differences. But what we see markedly after, I think, the 90s is that there was a change in even just the preoccupation of children's literature. At least that's from my observation. Now I think there's much more, we are talking more about what is missing and what we need to be bringing into the books, which is great.
There's a book, I think it's an NBT book, it's called, I think it's called My India or something. And it's a picture book. And every page has sort of kids from different states. So it becomes a kind of, like taxonomy of India, where it's about, food and dress and religious festivals and that sort of thing. And I think it's a little later, it's 1980. But this, that nation building project, which led to the setting up of all of these cultural institutions, NBT, CBT, CFSI, all of these, in a way, they were, there is a legacy of those institutions which has actually unleashed the problems that we are dealing with, because there was a kind of understanding of what the arts and education were to enable. And for that time, I cannot, and I don't really question the intention. I don't think it was coming from malintent. I don't know that. But I think that it ended up causing this problem, where it's a kind of top-down approach of what is required to be able to build this nation. And I feel that in the kind of representation, so of course, I think you're right that, because of the way things get disbursed, at least something gets produced. So this happened even with Doordarshan, there will be programs which were coming from the Northeast, so at least something is there. But then we get so used to just saying, at least this is there, but that's the problem, because actually then that at least is reproducing like nobody's thinking about form and craft and what is being pushed in those stories. So we end up then saying, it should be like, there should be own voices and there should be other voices. But that's the problem. It's not about that binary, no?
Yeah. It's also a question of whose point of view are we pushing, no? That's really ultimately the thing, that you're always, even if you're writing about diverse kind of people, who's writing about them? That's the thing. So, I'd like to bring in the thing of illustration here, because I think what Tara has done in that sense is really good, because they have, so, if you consider, if you look at a book like, I brought it with me because I thought it was such a fantastic book, like the London Jungle book. I think it's one of the most radical books to have come out in recent times, in the way it's reversed the anthropological eye, so far we've only got used to the West for one, and also the upper class looking at the other as to use that. I don't know if that's the right word to use, but we've got used to that particular way of looking. The point of view is always like that. So to reverse that and have a book where Bhajju is looking at the Western world through his eye was a terrific radical thing. I think it's one of my favorite books of all time for that reason, because he's just brought his own background and culture and looked at the Western world through that. And that's such a rare thing to see. And after that, a lot of, indigenous art has come into the children's book space, which I think is something really amazing.
Anushka, that sort of is really such an important point. Like when we talk about diversity, and we do, right? Like there is this whole conversation around diversity and representation and inclusivity are in many ways just words, right? Like and we, I guess, in this conversation, don't really look at the, I guess, don't really take up what complex questions do these, what are the complex questions that we need to take up to do this work, right? Like sort of just thinking of, are we doing the work of diversity is, especially in this sort of English publishing for children's literature, always to look at the other, right? There's always, and I guess that brings me to this idea of audience. So who are you writing for, right? Like who do you imagine your audience to be while you're creating or publishing the work that you are? And how do you relate that to diversity? And would that influence how you think of or take that up in your work?
Yeah. So most of us, as we said right at the start, we're speaking here of books mostly written in English. So we already know, the kind of children who are going to be reading those books. So to some extent, I feel that the books that when we talk about representation in those kind of books, it's more about, it's more about getting these urban privileged children to be aware of children who are not like them. So whereas if you're writing, the language question in this country is so complex. You know that language is related to class. So if you're writing in English, you're already presupposing a certain kind of audience. I don't know if that'll change in the coming years, but at the moment, that's how it is. So whereas if you look at writing, like I've looked at books written in different languages, right? In say Marathi, which is one of the few languages that I do read, Marathi or Hindi, and I find that there's a very different kind of storytelling even, and I'm unable to get my head into that way of thinking somehow. And I've always wondered why that happens. And maybe it has something to do with the fact that the language that we're writing in also assumes a certain kind of reader. It assumes a certain kind of structure, both in terms of language and in the kind of things that we're writing about. And I really don't know how to get past that. I've tried reading. It's not only true of books in Indian languages, but like even if you try to read a book in translation, a Chinese book I read in translation, and I had the same problem that I'm not able to relate to that kind of storytelling. And I don't know if that is connected to representation, and that's something that if anybody else has any ideas on that, I'd like to hear about that. I hope this is not too confusing to bring into this discussion. But I really do see a difference in the kind of storytelling when it's in different languages.
And I guess, again, to what before I kind of, sorry, I'm just so excited to sort of keep barging into your own. Vinuta brought that up, right? This idea of like, and I think it's been there in the chat, and maybe this is sort of the right time to bring it in, this idea of own voices, right? And I like, who gets to tell what story, and do you only write your own, or do you only write from your own sort of location, right? And I don't know if some of that gets to what you're talking about, Anushka. I mean, and I'm not like I'm not a proponent of like, let's do just own voices, but I mean, so what would that bring in, right? Like somebody writing from that experience.
Can I respond to that? respond to this first, Rabani?
Yes.
Yeah. Quickly, I think, Anushka, what you're talking about is quite. I mean, I speak 4 languages and read in 2 more. Uh, but there are differences. Each language has its own sort of culture of storytelling, and you see that differently. I mean, if you read a story in Kannada and read a story in Hindi, the entire sort of and you're right. I don't think there's a way in which I can even define it, but it's there, and I think that does do something to the experience of translation and how it's translated. But coming to what Rabani is asking just now about our voices, I'd just like to take an example of how we are doing it at PARI for now. So at the People's Archive of Rural India, we have, because we go into the field and bring stories from rural India, and we also have in our amongst us many reporters who live and report from where they are. So we work very closely with writers who are not, who are not trained journalists, who are not even writers in their own mind to begin with, but we work a lot with people who want to tell their stories and to bring those stories into the People's Archive and then also translate them. So we do translate, most of our stories get translated into 13 languages and go back to, and we try to sort of engage the people whom we write about to read their own stories after we've written it, but to also authenticate that we've, written it as they would like to say. So our storytelling is very, very so at the editing stage, we are very careful about not putting ourselves into the story. We are very clear that the sources that we are bringing the story from are the storytellers. So it's their voice that comes through very strongly. And if you read any of the stories in PARI, I mean, you'll see that that is the case. So as reporters who are in the field, we don't. And there are times because of the way in which we are taught to write that we do come back with a bit of that, put our own baggage into it. But at the editing stage, we try to make sure that that is kept aside. We also do something, we have a project called the PARI Education, which works. So 2 of my colleagues stationed in Bangalore, Preeti and Vishaka, they work closely with schools and colleges around the country who invite them to talk to students and also work with students to write stories for PARI. So they go out and get stories that are, that fall under PARI's objectives. And in the process of writing the story, they learn so much. And now we've even launched the PARI Education website where these stories are being published and getting translated in turn. But yeah, many of these children are from, colleges and schools that are English speaking, and our primary language is English at the moment. But these are things that we would also like to change, being aware that we want to bring in more inclusivity and diversity. So it's going in stages for us. But so the PARI Education Initiative is really, really something that has taken root, and it just grew even without our expectation. It just grew because so many more schools were interested in having, and now many PARI stories are coming into the curriculum as well. And recently we've even launched these books with Karadi Tales. So Shobha, in fact, took the initiative and said, so these are fictionalized books based on true stories from PARI. And they're chapter books, they're meant for 10 to 15-year-olds, so not really, they're YA segment. But this is another way in which we are trying to do work that can kind of, there's the our voices, others' voices, and how do you bring all this in? So that's what we are doing through PARI. And I think it's a fair model because I think I saw that question that Asha had asked, then do urban writers and illustrators, is it that they can't do anything? That's not true. I think the concerns that we should be working with, I think that's where we need to bring in more awareness as writers and as publishers, editors, that what are the kind of stories we want to tell? How do we collaborate more than taking the onus onto ourselves? How can we collaborate more with people to be able to bring in this diversity and inclusivity?
Okay,
I've
can
seen
I
those.
add to that?
Hmm.
Can I?
Oh,
What I'd
Samina.
like to say is that, so this idea of where do we write from? So we write, the place we write from is really our own, right? We write always from our own location. But, what is the life that we lead? How do we, in that life, how do we embrace diversity? Because then that is going to become our entry point into what we write about. So it is not that because, I'm not a sort of rural person. I've never lived in a village. Does that mean that I can never write about that setting or a character that is based in that setting? I don't really agree. I think that it depends on what is my point of entry into that. How have I engaged with that space? How have I reflected upon that? And that has to come from lived experience. It can't. And lived experience can include really good research as well. So I'm saying that there are many ways of bringing that into your book, but it will always come from my space and how I'm from my location and who I'm interacting with other spaces. So so in this conversation between own voices and others, the problem is that, like, actually, what's my voice? My voice, is it a Muslim voice? Is it a woman's voice? Is it a grown up trying to write for a children's voice? Who's my voice? What's my voice? I'm so many things, and why should I only have to be writing only from that one position, and then I'm only going to, like, because I've written Hina in the Old City and Shabananda Devi Good, it means I'm forever doomed to writing about Muslim characters,
Yeah, just taking off from that, Samina, I've read the Pari books, which Karadi brought out, many of them, not all yet. But basically that's what they've done, right? These people who are working very closely with various communities. Each one is about a different kind of community and a different topic, and they work very closely, and then they fictionalize those stories and written it. And the people who are writing it are the journalists. Sometimes the journalists themselves, sometimes someone else. I think Vishakha has written one. The person.
Vishakha is a journalist, but Niveda. Yeah.
Yeah. So all of them are not. Yeah. So basically, this is what they're doing, right? What you said. They have their entry point is the fact that they work very closely with these children. So, but can I just say this, that in some of the books, I do feel that sense of that distance. Then it becomes a little bit like what Asha was saying, that the book is important because it is about this or because it is about that, and not engaging in itself. And that's always a bit of a danger when you start off with a project, So that's something I think that again is a question of skill and maybe practice and maybe just the practice of empathy, I think, and craft. That's what I mean. Skill.
I mean, so it's not enough to have the voice, but what is the voice saying and how is it saying it? I think the how is really important, Like that's that. How do we tell a story which is like a good story, And in that telling of that, that there's this quote which I came across, that all pedagogical art is bad art, but all good art is pedagogical.
Nice.
Yeah,
Charles has been trying to say something for a long time.
No, that's all right. It's very fascinating. I just kind of keep feeling that, I don't think there is a opposition between, I don't know how to say this, own voice to, mainstream voice or whatever, but I definitely think that it has been very skewed, that continuously who gets published, who gets, taught, who gets read has definitely been so skewed over time. And so, I mean, to the extent that actually, we're looking at all different kinds of skewings, right? So whether it is, even if you look at the kind of sales that you have of Enid Blyton still today in this country, if that's being continuously read, so a colonial sort of thing, which, a lot of people write paeans to it even today, that is still sort of one of the most read English stuff for children in this country. We're talking of a very skewed sort of thing, which is whether it is caste, whether it's colonialism, whether it's region, whether it's Brahmins, there is that whole thing. And I feel that own voices is not pitted against it. And also, amongst all the literature that's available, there's so many terrible stories, but they're there. I mean, I'm not an Enid Blyton fan, and I think they're particularly sort of annoying stories, many of them. And, but, they're like sort of being read as if they're this great literature all the time. And so, yes, let there be terrible stories also, no, from own voices, that's okay. Like, it's not like the scrutiny of art and craft should be on those who are marginalized most, right? That you don't want the most radical stories or the most beautifully crafted stories from those who are the most marginalized. Everybody is writing and trying different things. Do you have enough space for every voice to be heard is the question. And which also implies the question very much of who your reader is, because if we're continuously writing for the consumption of a middle class, upper middle class, English speaking, urban, child who wants to continuously look at other people as other, or are we also, when we are writing, you're imagining that, okay, a child somewhere else is also reading this book in English, because books in English are being read everywhere also. I mean, what Eklav is doing, what Muskan is doing, what, Pari is doing, the children everywhere reading books in English. So your imagination of the reader needs to also shift, right? From this reader to any reader. I mean, which is, when I say this very funnily, I also, of course, feel that, when I sit and write, actually, I don't imagine any reader. For me, there is no readership. I mean, if I thought of other people reading, I would never be able to write. So I actually just write because there's this character in my head and we are having conversations and we write, and, I'm hoping that that character actually likes my story and I like the story, and, that makes me happy. But once it is done and once, it is going out into the world, then there are concerns of what the story is doing. I cannot escape it. And so therefore, I feel that, for example, if you look at how many sort of writings from Adivasi writers do you have from around the country available in English to read? They're available in many languages. So you have, people trying to do that, because also you look at English as this language which sort of gets much more footage than any other language, right? But except that a lot of languages, the kind of publishing being done is very crucial. Or I'm thinking of, when Anveshi produced that set of 9-10 books by beautiful, very wonderful writers and very amazing artists coming together to put those books. I mean, they were a treat, because you have some of the best writers from different languages, some of the best sort of artists coming together to produce books which are, sort of easily not expensive and available. So I don't know, I think there's lots to be done. And I feel that there is room for everything. I feel that there is room for more and more people. I also feel that online publishing, things like Pratham, are making that huge difference, because there is, and I think copyleft is also great, so that more people can use books, that more people can access books. It's nicer, because then, you sort of are not sort of feeling this great sort of authorship forever and after. It's great for books and stories to be out there. And I don't know.
I do think that our idea of aesthetics also is, like what is good, what is a good story, what is a good craft, I think these are shifting. They are not, again, cast in stone, like you said, Charles. In fact, if Ruby was here, she would probably have told us, and she has spoken about this in other forums, that when she set out as a Santal publisher and writer, when she set out to bring out her two children's books, Taisun Hul, the printer itself, he was against her using so much black. He said black is just, it's not a color to be used. You can't use black in children's books. And she had to fight to even use that color. So her perspective of how aesthetics itself in publishing, how she has encountered it, I really wish she was here on the panel to talk about some of these aspects. As a publisher who started out without any background, I mean, she'd done a course, but had started with no real legacy to begin with, and produced these beautiful books in the end. But yeah, I mean, this was just to add to what you were saying, Shaz.
No, I agree that there is room for and there is a need for more. Absolutely. But I don't think that there's a choice about, like, should the burden of good craft only be placed on own voices? Actually, the burden of good craft is placed on anybody who takes up the craft. I think that that's for us. That's our challenge. And that's the challenge of all practice. So actually, I feel that even for publishers, the challenge of their practice has to be that, what is am I doing enough in terms of form to be able to put different kinds of books out there. So yes, I think this is a very good example of the use of black in children's books, for example, to be able to rethink that. So that too, I mean, first of all, aesthetics is subjective. How we the question, I think, is really about, like, are we in the process interrogating ourselves enough or not? Because how do you push the boundaries? How do you make room for more if we don't do that? And it's not. I don't think that it. If we are to say that, just it's okay, let there be bad stories, like what you're saying, Charles, that's the first step. I accept that. I accept that, it's a process and we need to, like, have many things. But it is that, at least wo ho gaya, at least wahan ki story nikal ke aa gayi. And I don't think we should be content with that.
Of course not.
Mindful of the time, and I'm going to take one last sort of broad theme here, and that's sort of around issues in the field that you see, right? So the larger pressures that make publishers or editors maybe sort of not take up some of these issues, right? Not produce diverse literature, and I guess I see Anushka nodding her head, so I'm going to start off.
All about money, honey. I was thinking.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess that just what are the issues in the field, right? Like in the field that you see, and we've talked about some of those, but I thought as sort of like a wrap up before we open it up for everyone.
Yeah. So this is fairly random thought that came from what Samina just said, no, what you just said about Ruby, actually, Vinita said about what Ruby said about black and white. So when we started off at Tara with books like Tiger on a Tree and all that, there was so much, everyone was so shocked because Tiger on a Tree again is black and white initially, the orange was added later by the designer. And there was, so at that time, the idea of good children's illustration was very much, it was very much the Disney kind of illustration, lots of flat colors. And the reason that happens is very obvious, is because Disney had the money, and so they had the market was there. The Disney books were everywhere. That kind of illustration was everywhere. So it comes down to money and power. No? Ultimately, all of this comes down to money and power. Who has the money and who has the power to decide what kind of books are published? But you see, that has changed. So I think everything in that sense, because we have become more aware, and we have also publishers have become more, I hope. I think to a large extent it's the small independent publishers who are bolder and who are doing things that buck the money trend, as it were. So I forgot where I was going with this. So the point is that it's something that publishers also need to do consciously. Publishers are, of course, especially the big money guys, and now, with one publisher buying up all the other publishers, I don't know where this is going to end, because, once all the power and all the money is vested in one place, then it just reduces the possibilities of diversity. And so I think it's very important that small independent publishers are encouraged, and because they're the ones who can change things, like Ruby is doing. Her publishing house is publishing those kind of books which nobody else can, and Tara is doing by bringing in a lot of indigenous people. At Dugwell, we try to do as much diverse stuff is possible. It's still happening now. I don't know how long it will go on. So I think that it is the small and independent publisher who's finally going to make a difference in the long run.
If they can survive.
Yeah, yeah, that's what we have to encourage them. Buy lots of books by small and independent publishers. What else can we do? Yeah, it is difficult to survive. I mean, look at us. We had to finally give up because we just couldn't manage it.
Samina, would you like to sort of add something to this?
I definitely think that I'm just going to add a little bit from a slightly different place that I think that opening out what stories are themselves also is crucial. I think, what is storytelling, what is kind of stories, that I think there's also that. So I feel that what earlier was being talked about, that in different languages, there are different traditions of storytelling, but also I'm trying to sort of say that, for example, if you look at different ways in which language is used itself. So I think somewhere, I don't know, what I'm looking for is sort of more openness. I don't know where it's going to come from because at some level you see that what the big publishers are doing and what is selling more. I mean, it is very distressing to see Devdutt Patnaik sort of doing children's books also, and there being more and more of that. There is this push for different kinds of ideology, and it's annoying.
Gita,
distressing.
Mythology.
Huh?
Sorry, so much mythology. Sorry,
it is very distressing. It's because it's so much sort of going hand in hand with the right-wing ideology all around us. It's sort of you want to sort of really jump up and down and say, okay, there are these other publishers who are putting in these little books which need to be read more. I don't know how to, do this, except I think that sort of make them more and more available in all platforms possible. So, I mean, considering that I know for sure that I'm not making a living out of my writing. So, and it is difficult. I mean, I'm like, fine, copyleft, take it, read, but also I want to say that when we are doing this exclusivity thing, I think some of the things is crucial to go back to the earlier question about we do need people from different locations. For example, what does the world look from when you're dealing with it with a disability, which makes most of the structures, material structures and everything inaccessible to you in different ways? I think this is important to write about. This is locations which because finally writing, all of us who have grown up reading so much know what books have done for us. For somebody like me who always felt very outsider, alien, and completely sort of, never part of anybody else, I think books provided that space. And so somewhere I'm also still thinking of those who feel outside, what do books do for that person? How do they do that? How do they sort of open worlds for that person and make that person feel a belonging? I think there is still that magic of books. No? So somewhere we have to keep on doing that with stories. And I don't know, figure out ways of collectivizing and pushing publishers to publish some of that. Maybe saying that, okay, this is a good writer, please publish this writer, or just saying, fine, I'm going to just put them all online and, hope that they go to places. I don't know, but we'll have to keep on, doing different ways of doing things, I think, even more and more so.
I think that there have to be, many strategies at many levels by many stakeholders. It's not, there isn't a kind of, one or two size fits all type of situation. So I think that, for us as writers, we have to challenge ourselves and say, like, what are we writing about? Who are we writing for? Why are we writing this story? How do I make the story better? Those are our challenges. But I think that for publishers, they do need to think here in India about, like formal experiments. And I don't think there's enough of that. Um, yeah, the burden of that is largely on the indie publishers. But even in that space, I feel that, like, of course, we know why. I mean, the whole political economy of the space is such. But I do think that we don't have enough variety in the kind of formal sort of experiments. And the I mean, if you look at, a book like Brown Girl Dreaming, I don't think, I mean, that it doesn't fit in, like, if as a manuscript, I wonder when it came, like, how did they fit in? Like, it's the form of that book doesn't fit neatly into, this or that. And, it's a YA book in this kind of way, or but it did well. I mean, someone took it on and then it did well. So I feel that risks have to be taken more by all stakeholders. And I think publishers can make room for, like collaborative practices of the kind that Vinuta has talked about. I think that's a really good beginning, particularly in our context with the challenges of language. I know that, Nina Sabnani has, because of the larger work that she does, and, her children's books have come out of that larger practice. But that again is an example of collaboration and how collaboration can actually lead to the creation of a good, work of art. So I think publishers can think a little bit more about these processes of collaboration and what forms they should take and how they should, because even that doesn't have to be only in one way. There can be many different ways of collaborating. But yeah, we all need to kind of, I think, keep challenging ourselves and taking risks.
I think, I mean, as someone who sort of looks at publishing at an industry level, and some of the things that we've tried to do through Publishing Next is to bring people together so that there are, these collaborations can happen. I would like to see more publishers in English collaborate with publishers in the Indian languages. There are many things that are possible to be done. There are not enough platforms bringing us together, but I really wish that there was more active seeking of these collaborations. And because English publishers have a certain, they have an advantage, all said and done, that they can try and get these conversations started. There's a lot of interest. I can speak, knowing many Indian language publishers, I can say this with confidence that there is interest in collaborations with the English language publishers. I think we just need to imagine the space that we are working in and in a larger way than just doing what we are setting out to do. I think English publishers bringing out books in languages I mean, when it comes to English language publishers, book publishers, when they can actually collaborate, I don't know why they get into the language space and do it badly. You can go and reach out and find very good publishers in the languages and work with them, and authors and illustrators. I mean, there are many possibilities, and that's my advice to publishers, in fact, that please go out and look at others and work with others. Having said that, I'd like to just end my part of this today by just citing a very happy story about how one of Pari's stories traveled, because I'm also keen that we talk about how do we make books available to readers that cannot afford them or cannot access them because of the way that infrastructure is constructed, book infrastructure in the country is. So, a lot of rural children, besides their textbooks, even if they get their textbooks, there's a lot of material they don't have access to. And one of our stories that a colleague of mine, Aparna Karthikeyan, had written about this young boy from Chennai who grew up in a fisher community near Chennai in Kovalam, called Kali. He became a Bharatanatyam dancer and trained at Dakshin Chaitra and at Kalakshetra. And his story has traveled because it was made into a story weaver story by Aparna and an illustrator. And another Pari fellow who is part of a group that runs leadership programs in the villages in Maharashtra near Kolhapur district. So one of those leaders, the community leader, she is a teacher with students, young students, with whom she discussed the story, and they had this entire conversation about gender, and they made a video of it. And so we can see how this young teacher is using this Kali story as a boy who wanted to learn Bharatanatyam, who comes from a fishing community, does not have a traditional background in it, and his mother's questions to him and his own conviction and how. And so this teacher is explaining this to the students and then talking about how everybody should be able to do. So there's, conversation about dignity of labor. There's conversation about what gender roles are for men and women. And the way that conversation takes place it's in Marathi, but it's so effortless and so beautiful. And it uses this one story from Chennai. So it's mediated through so many channels. It's a Tamil story that Aparna has written in English. And through Story Weaver, it's been illustrated, and then it's in Marathi. So what I'm trying to say is that this is possible. This is very much possible. And we should work towards many more of these things.
So much. And I'm going to open this up to the participants for questions. You can just unmute yourself and put this on a gallery view. I guess I can't see everyone. Yes, please.
Can I? Yeah. So one was the collaboration that just came up. It's not really a question. I have a couple of questions. So I'm wondering if we can have conversations about how to make these collaborations fair and ethical before we get into them and find that we are being exploitative in a way. Maybe those conversations should happen proactively and not wait for us to get into situations where we find that we're not doing things right. That's one. Maybe Squibby could initiate something like that. The other was something I think we haven't touched upon today. We're paid peanuts, like I think Charles said, we don't make a living out of this. So that being the case, what can we do to make it, to enable people who need to earn to write? Is it enough if I say, I need to be paid better, I need to be given my royalties? And will that enable it? Is that enough? I mean, that's been my approach, but it doesn't seem like enough to me. I don't know what we can do. So that's a question to the panelists. The other is about hierarchies. I think, again, Charles had mentioned that. Do we have hierarchies in the publishing industry? I haven't actually closely observed the industry, so I don't know. Do we have them, and what can we do to help the situation? Do we have hierarchy in our community, hierarchies in our own communities as writers and illustrators and creators? Do we see, in terms of, say, a lit fest, is that something that we can actively work to address? How do we see people being treated by lit fest organizers, the bigger ones? And is there something that we can do just to look at our own role in this and how we can help? The other thing is about if you're writing without lived experience, the tendency, I see it, for me, I mean, I'm coming at it in both directions. Sometimes I find myself, I think it's difficult to plan what the story is about and then to start writing. I would never do that. If I come at it with an agenda, it's impossible sometimes, but it happens that organically, because of something I've been engaging with, I find that there's very strong emotion and the story just bursts out of me. But even then, it's very important for me to question myself, like someone said, to constantly interrogate. No, but what are the questions that I have to ask myself? One is, have I done my research? Now, I think it's natural for me to answer that with a yes and say that, yes, I have done enough research, but how much is enough? Have I brought my own prejudices in? How would I know? Is it enough if I have sensitivity readers? Who are my sensitivity readers? How do I know that I've picked the right people? What point in their own journey are they? What is their level of awareness? What are their own biases? So these again are questions. The other thing that happens is, for me, it may be a story because I am looking at it from the outside. But for someone else, it's just slice of life. So where's the story? Where's the arc? Where's the narrative? Where's the plot? Right? Because for me, it looks like a story because it's all very exotic, because I'm an outsider. Then there's a question of gaze. I mean, it's very easy to think of it as male gaze when, as a woman, I look at a film and I say, oh, this is male gaze. But when I'm on the other side, I don't realize that I'm doing it. The gaze is wrong. I don't see that the gaze is wrong. I think that question I have to ask myself then is, am I able to step into the head of the character? Have I been able to do that? If not, then the gaze is wrong. But I think there are many other questions. When we say interrogate ourselves, how can we break that down into questions that we can ask ourselves? And we have to be honest also with ourselves, maybe. And at what point? I think we don't have to publish everything that we write, even if it happens organically, even if it's just something that's come. I should be able to, at some point, step back and say, no, I shouldn't put this out into the world. Maybe there's a better person who can tell this story. And it's not, even if there's no story like this before, no one has written about this. I think the about is a big problem. But maybe I should just not publish it. Publishing doesn't have to be the end goal. But I think I've put out a lot of questions. So.
That's incredible, actually, Arundhati. I think that what you've done is actually sort of put in a lot of points which are, important, and I think which each one of us should be asking ourselves anyway. And I think the point, I think also you're absolutely right. What does your story do? Who's reading it, and what does it mean for that person is so crucial. I was doing this exercise for thinking, for example, because gender and sexuality is something, I talk about in my, sort of life all the time. So I was thinking that when I look at a book, when I look at gender, I think some of the questions I ask, right, which I sort of asking. So I'm just going to sort of add a list of questions that as a writer or even as a reader, I ask myself, that, for example, when I'm looking at any book, I want to look at the characters and see who occupies what space, right? So I interrogate that who are the characters in this book? Who occupies what space? Who gets listened to? Who gets, who has how much power in that? So whoever the characters are, these are questions that I think I formally sort of, they just come naturally to me to ask. And so, for example, what do different families look like? What does the community look like? Who's there? Who forms family? Who forms community? What are their roles? What are these people wearing? What is the visual language? What is their hair like? What are their gestures like? What is the body shapes like? How is this put on paper? And what is the language people are speaking? What is the kind of authority that's coming from different places? Who is listening to whom more carefully? What is being taken for granted already in the story to be a story? That this is how a family functions, or this is what food is. What is it? So, I mean, these are questions that I think I'm saying. So when I look at just one aspect of just who the characters are, these are all the questions and many more that spring to my head. So I'm going to just add them to the kind of questions you were saying that, as a writer, I must ask myself. I ask these questions to myself, when I'm sort of writing something, or when I finally have written something, or when I'm reading a book. I look at it. I know that sometimes a lot of books become very tiresome for me because they're so normative in what they portray continuously. I don't want to read them. They may be great stories, but I really don't want to read another great story about yet another normal farm family. I'm bored. So I won't read it, so I'll just put it away. So I'm saying that these are questions that, so I think we could make a list of questions about the various kinds of things, Similarly, you could look at when you look at caste or class, how is it being portrayed? What kind of family is this? What kind of people are there? Where do they belong? Who would feel a sense of belonging when reading this,
Thank you for answering that, Charles.
Actually, not answering it, just adding to it because.
Adding to does anyone else want to take that up in response to Arundhati, or we have another question? Maybe have time for about maybe we can take in one or two more questions, or thoughts or insights.
See, I've always been very, very wary of writing about, again, not about, or writing of people who I'm not familiar with. So I completely understand, Arundhati, where you're coming from, that, when you're writing, I'd especially be afraid of the gaze, because, that's something that you're not even aware of. But I can't think of any better way to do it than to have readers from different kinds of readers read it and tell you if there's something that doesn't sit well, you know. Like I know that when Charles's book was being illustrated, she had to struggle quite a lot with the normativity of the kind of illustrations that were being done. Remember, Charles, in Timmy?
Yeah. Yeah, yeah,
You
yeah.
know, it's so people so easily fall into certain ways of depicting women and all that, and Shaz had to really struggle with that. But you know, because she was there to guide Shreya finally got it right. So it helps to have people, have different kinds of people read what you've written. I can't think of any better way to do it than that. And of course, you yourself have to be constantly aware, and you're already questioning yourself. So that's a good place to start from.
I think no book can really, I think we should, what am I trying to say? I think no book can really be fully representative of anything. And we should be open to all kinds of criticism when it comes. Because as we move more and more towards an identity awareness, there is bound to be, but second guessing ourselves, there's this sort of balance that we'll have to strike, you know, that one is to interrogate yourself, but also not to second guess yourself so much that you're not able to write.
Paralyzed,
It's even worse. And I think it's okay if some people don't, you know, agree with the book or don't agree with what's there. I think as long as we can sincerely keep doing what we want to do and trying to learn and be more aware of what we are doing, I think that's
and also accept when you have gone wrong. Like look what's happened with Hamilton, you know.
Yeah.
He came from a place of great awareness and all that. It's now he's being criticized, and he's accepted that, you know, there were things that he could have done differently. I think that's also important, to keep yourself open to that kind of criticism.
But I'm just thinking also of this time when the Karadi book about the pug, the book with the dog and the pug, and how it fell into controversy. And at Publishing Next, we had issued a statement in supporting the book and saying that, you know, we shouldn't, that the writer shouldn't be targeted, etc. But I had to face on my Facebook wall the amount of anger and vitriol. Oh, it took me 4 days of continuous this thing. And because the book was so beautiful and it's so, but it really caused hurt in the Sikh community. And it's amazing that something as simple as that could have led to that. So now, you know, one is constantly wondering about identity and how to represent identity and what are the ways in which, because it's becoming like that. I think we are being pushed into spaces of having to keep defending certain kinds of identities and being questioned about, you know, who we are all the time. If you're not following a particular majoritarian path, then you're left to defend each part of you, and you hang on to whatever feels comfortable. And that's what I saw in that entire exchange that came our way during that book, when we showed support to the book, was that people just felt insulted and they couldn't quite identify why they felt insulted. It was just the fact that there was a dog in question and there was a pug in question, you know, but of course I could say that because I'm not a Sikh, but the writer was a Sikh, is a Sikh, and I'm not a Sikh. So I couldn't even ask them, why are you feeling insulted? You know, because for a minute I was like, okay, what is my location in this? To even
but see, this also throws up this idea of location. Now, the writer was a Sikh, and for her, it was not something that was insulting at all. So, you know, in some ways, we are always going to be writing the other. And, you know, I mean, like Charles, I think, said, and I know this is true for me also, I don't think of a reader when I'm writing. I'm writing actually for me, I think, you know, like me at some stage in my life, perhaps what I was like, maybe as a child, I don't know, you know, it's a kind of very amorphous thing. So in that context, I guess all all that we can keep doing is, like, I don't think there can also be a finite list of questions. Questions will have to change and grow depending on what it is that we are writing. And yeah, I think, Arundhati, you're right that not everything necessarily needs to be published. And that's again part of that interrogation process, for us to think that, like, is it, should it be put out or should someone else put it out? I don't know. That's also one of the questions. But I think it's not like we can arrive at a kind of like fully finished, like sometimes we do, I guess, and sometimes many writers are lucky that they do that often. But I think there can be an unfinished or maybe some slightly problematic things left in a kind of a piece of work. I don't actually have too much of a problem with that everything has to be neat and polished. And I think it's okay if there are some things for us to, as long as it makes me think and feel something, I'm okay if there are some problems.
Last words. Did I cut someone off? Okay.
Can't hear you, Rabani.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
I was just asking if anyone has any last point. We're at time, so maybe we're about to. Okay, I covered a lot of ground. This was such a good conversation. So thank you so much for coming here, to all the participants, to all of you, for this first in the series on representation. And I guess I'm sort of Squibby's probably planning many more, and I'm looking forward to those. And I'm wrapping this conversation with some of these points that you all raised. How can we collaborate to bring in the other and own voices? It's not enough to have voices in, but really focusing on what the voice is saying, who gets published, who gets read. Is there enough space for all voices to be heard or read? And what does your story or your writing really do? And what are the different ways to think about identity? Vinita, taking from your last, I think that was a really important point that you raised. And Samina, you had the wrapping point, just saying that in some ways we are always writing the other. It's just such that's so I'm going to end it right there with that. And Tanu, will we have the recording? I guess my final question would be, I know some people asked for your email IDs of the panelists and as well as the recording. So I'm not sure if you want to answer that.
So recording would be available soon. We are trying to put together a YouTube channel. It should be there in a few days. We are a little tech challenged, so we're figuring all that out. And meanwhile, I have put the details of Squibby in the chat. In case you have not taken the membership, do check it out. And thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ravani, for putting this together. And thank you, everyone. This was really, really insightful.
Thank you, Tanu and Ravani and everyone
Thanks,
else. It's been quite an
you.
amazing session. I look forward to listening to, all the others. And yes, I'm happy with the recordings or email IDs being shared. So, but thank you. This has been quite incredible. Samina, Ravani, Anushka, Vinita.
Yeah.
Tanu.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed listening to everybody, and I think, this should not end with at least we had that one session, so we have to do many more.
Yeah,
because there are many people missing at the table.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right then. See you with the
Bye,
Bye,
everyone.
everybody. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.